You asked a question earlier about whether I ever felt like in danger at all. This night probably fell into that category. I was inside my camper and something came up outside my camper, but it was making the most ungodly sounds. I mean, it was a cross between growls and screams, and it literally sounded like it was right outside my camper. And I have to say that as much as I want to, in some ways, see one of these up close, that particular night, I was afraid to go outside. I didn't want to open my camper door. I didn't have a light. My flashlight had broken earlier that same day, and I didn't feel comfortable opening my camper door and going out into the dark to see what it was.
I'd like to welcome Mark to Bigfoot Crossroads. Mark is a Bigfoot investigator. His investigations have taken him all over the place. Thanks, Mark, for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, we just had a little bit of a hiccup with the infamous Bigfoot curse. Leave it to things to go wrong anytime you talk about Bigfoot. So,
oh, sure.
You were saying, what got you started on this journey?
Well, in 1973, I was camping with a friend, and he was a little older than me, so I kind of looked up to him, took his word for things. But we were camping, and somewhere around midnight, it had started to rain, just very light, and he was asleep, and I had maybe dozed off, but I woke up and I heard what sounded like somebody walking around the edge of our camping area. And we were under a tarp and had a fire going, but the fire had died down. So I threw some more wood on it and got it going pretty good. And I could see the outline of what looked like a very large person. And so I got a little bit worried, not knowing what it was. So I woke him up and I told him, and he got up and he looked and he saw it too. And he said, that's the old hermit that lives back here in the woods. He said, I've seen him before, and he's weird because he has long hair and he wears a fur coat all year round, even in the summertime. And so I just kind of took his word for it that it was a hermit, but this figure continued to hang around for several hours till probably around 3 a.m. Even my friend was getting a little scared, and so he said, well, let's walk to the house. So we're probably a half a mile at least from my house. And I said, there's no way I'm leaving this campfire, in the dark and not knowing, what this is out there. And so we ended up staying till it got daylight, probably 5:30, 6 o'clock. And we left and we walked up to my house. And at the time, Bigfoot wasn't really on my mind, and so I didn't think to look for tracks or, anything like that. We just got away from there. And a little bit I'll add to that, not long after that, my brother, who was actually 19 years older than me, had been back there. He had some cars that he would go from time to time and get parts off of and things. And he had gone back there. And he, as far as I know, I felt like he wasn't afraid of anything. And I wasn't there at the time, but my mother told me later, she said he came to the house and he came roaring up in his car from back at what we call back in the back end, which was where this was at in the wooded part of our farm. And she said he was white as a ghost, and he came in the house, and she said, "What in the world is wrong with you?" And he said, "I'm not going to tell anybody what just happened because they'll think I'm crazy." Well, I suspect that he also saw what was lurking around the edge of our campfire that night. And so anyway, that kind of led me down the path to having an interest. It was probably a few years later before it really dawned on me that what I had probably seen that night was, in fact, a Bigfoot. But that kind of got me started on the path. And so then I've been interested ever since.
The figure that you saw, you said it was there for a very long time. Was it just hanging out in the trees watching, or was it pacing around? What was it doing?
It was walking around, but it would stay just far enough out that it was difficult to really see. But when I would build the fire up, it would move farther away. And as the fire would die down, it would come closer in. It was very much conscious of where or how close it could get before it could be very obviously identified. And but it was definitely close enough that we could see that it was a very large figure. Like I said, I couldn't say that it was hair covered, but I just took my friend's word that he had seen it before, and that he thought it was a hermit that lived in the woods, which, in hindsight is kind of funny to think about, but, we were just teenagers, so that didn't seem so odd to me at the time. But, it was also, I would say, if it was a man, it was a very, very large man. I didn't really have anything to judge size by, but, I come from a family of fairly large people. I have a brother that was 6'4" and a couple of uncles that were 6'7", 6'8", and I would say this figure was easily larger than any of them. So I would have to guess at least 7 foot. But again, it was dark. We were just seeing it in the firelight, and so didn't really have anything to judge size by. So that's just an estimate on my part.
Right. Stories of hermits living in the woods are something from decades ago. You don't really hear about them that much anymore. But the whole idea of, someone going off and living in the woods is to avoid people and get away from people. So it doesn't really make sense to me that a hermit would hang around people that it saw camping at night, or even be that active at nighttime. Humans can't see very well in the dark, and it's kind of dangerous. And if you're living out there by yourself, I just don't know why a person would be hanging around a campsite and just walking around all night. It doesn't really make any sense. But it also doesn't make sense for an animal to do that either. So it kind of leaves you with only one possibility at that point, if you're using logic to reach the conclusion.
Yeah, and that's kind of what took me down the path of thinking it had to be a Bigfoot. And, in hindsight, we weren't small children. We were teenagers, but at the same time, I've read a lot of reports of Bigfoot being interested in younger people, children in particular. And so that, whether it's curiosity or, some people refer to them as watchers, they tend to, for whatever reason, have an interest in what people are doing. And so, and like I said, in hindsight, I've kind of gone through all the possibilities like you just talked about, and it's really the only thing that I could come up with. And so that really led my interest into trying to find out more about them.
Well, when did you make that crossover from just being interested to actively pursuing this?
Well, I was very interested and read a lot of material all through my life. After, I probably a few years, 2 or 3 years after that was when I maybe first saw the Patterson-Gimlin film, and then I saw The Legend of Boggy Creek, and I started to kind of make that connection. And then I started reading material. I used to be a very avid reader, and I read pretty much everything I could get my hands on, and I continued to do that and be interested through my career. I had a career, and then I had children, and it kind of limited how much time I could devote to any actual research. And I did have other things happen, but I didn't become really full-time research until 2018 when I retired. And then I started really spending a lot of time on expeditions and, spending time out actually actively seeking out information, experiences that I could have on my own.
You told me a story about a trip to Alaska, I believe. Was that part of your Bigfoot investigations, or was that just a trip?
No, it was actually, I worked in Alaska for quite a few years. And so it was while I was working there, I was actually living in a city called Cordova, which is on the east side of Prince William Sound. The only way in and out of that city are by a boat or airplane. There's no roads there. And there are roads once you get there. So I was living there. I had a vehicle, and I drove out to a spot where there's a glacier, and I wanted to walk up a trail to the glacier. And so I started up the trail, and I had probably made it maybe a half a mile. I'm not sure exactly, but I would guess about that. And it was almost like, not only did I hear something in my head, but I felt resistance as I was walking. I don't know how to explain that, but I heard basically in my head, I heard something say, "Stop." And so I stopped for a second, and I thought, what on earth was that? That was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that. At that time, I'd never heard of the phenomenon of Bigfoot doing mind speak or ESP. So I had absolutely no idea what it was. But I knew it felt very odd. And so, I'm not typically afraid of much. So I thought, well, it was just a weird coincidence. So I start to walk again, and I made it maybe 3 steps, so maybe tops 10 feet. And I felt a very strong push back. And I heard in my head again, "Stop now." And along with that, I didn't hear the words, but I had a very strong feeling that if I didn't stop, something bad was going to happen. It was like the hair on the back of my neck stood up, my arms, the hair stood up. So I stopped a minute, and I thought about it, and I thought, well, in my mind, I didn't, again, associate mind speak, but I thought, there must be a bear around here or something. Something is causing me to have the hair stand up and whatever. So I turned around and I left. Didn't see anything, didn't hear anything audibly. But then later on, as I became more interested and were watching a lot of videos on YouTube and still reading material, I heard people tell stories about very similar instances and what they called mind speak or ESP. And I thought, wow, that seems like exactly what happened to me. So again, didn't see anything, didn't audibly hear anything, but in my head, I definitely heard a very strong warning of not going on. And when I turned around and left, then everything was fine. I didn't have any more problems. I got back to my vehicle and went back home, and nothing else happened that day.
Why do you think some people experience that and not others?
The only thing I could say is that you have to be in the wrong place at the right time. I think there was a reason, whether it was because there was a young one. I mean, this was a trail I was on that people walk quite frequently. So there had to be, in my opinion, some reason why this happened on this particular day. There was something there that they did not want me around. Like I said, that's the only thing I can think of. I don't know that it's some people. It's just that you've got to be in as I said, the wrong place at the right time, and then they will warn you. Now, with that said, I know other people who have been in the wrong place and got what's called zapped, where they and I don't know if you're familiar, you probably are with that, and a lot of your listeners probably are, but a feeling of almost they call it zapped, because I understand now. I haven't had this happen to me, so there again, why does that happen to some and not others? Again, I think you've just got to be in that spot at the time when they don't want you there. And I have had people tell me that they felt like they were being told not to go on, but they went on anyway. And then that's when they got zapped. So that very well might be what would have happened to me that day had I continued on. I don't know that, but I've heard stories similar to that. So I think it's kind of the same thing. You've got to be in that spot. And when I say some people it happens, some don't, I just think some people haven't been in that spot yet to have either the warning in their mind or to be zapped because they maybe didn't pay attention to that warning.
Oftentimes, whenever people share experiences of mind speak situations, it seems to be a warning, especially get out of an area.
Right.
And I always found that kind of interesting in comparison to, the horror stories that you hear where, people are claiming these things are dangerous and will kidnap you or harm you if possible, in some cases eat you. But then you have these contrasting stories of people basically being saved by these things, being warned like something bad is going to happen if you don't leave the area.
All right.
It doesn't really make sense that, there would be that large of a contrast out there.
Well, but think of it in terms of humans. I mean, we have people in the human society that will help you go out of their way to do good things for you. And we have other people who would kill you for a $10 bill or less. And so, I personally, I don't have a problem with the contrast because I think they, in many ways, are similar to us, and that there is a huge variation in mentality and attitude, and just like there is in humans, I think there probably are. Just like with humans, I think there's probably 1,000 good people for every really, really bad person, the ones that would be willing to kill you, or maybe even the ratio might even be more than that. Maybe there's 10,000 good for one bad. I don't know, but I think the same thing may hold true. And that's kind of how I look at it anyway.
Yeah, but by nature, I just question things. And,
oh, sure.
Whenever, and I'm not doubting that mind speak occurs. I've talked to enough people. I've known people personally that have experienced it. And again, it was a warning type situation. But then I start to question, okay, well, if they can communicate that way? Why do they make vocalizations at all? Why don't the bad ones use it to their advantage and get inside of our heads to confuse us so they can take us or kill us or whatever they're going to do to us?
Right.
Do you think that it's possible that them being individuals like you're talking about, that some might have abilities that others don't have?
Oh, I really don't know. I don't have anything to really base an opinion or a judgment concerning that on. So, though, back to what you were saying about, do some of them have the ability, the bad ones, to use it to somehow trick people and maybe cause people harm? We don't really know that doesn't happen. I mean, there are thousands of people that disappear in the forests every year, and many of which aren't ever found. Now, what happens to those people? Nobody knows. The assumption is wild animals, or they fall into some kind of a area and get hurt where they're never found. But is it possible that maybe some of the bad ones are using something to trick these people and therefore do them harm? I don't know. No one knows, but I think it's definitely a possibility. Even if it seems out there a ways, it's something that could happen.
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at on that train of thought. Like you said, there are thousands of people that go missing in the wilderness, and we know that there's bountiful reasons why that can happen normally. Mm-hmm. But there are situations where it seems rather strange. And I guess if that happened to a person where it was used against them in a nefarious way, if you don't make it out of there, you don't get to share the story. So it may be one of those situations.
Exactly. I agree.
So tell me about the first official Bigfoot trip you made. The first time that you're like, okay, I'm going here and I'm investigating. Did you meet up with a group of people? Did you go solo?
Yeah. No, I had done a few things solo, but not with any results to speak of. And the first official one I went on was with a BFRO expedition, and it actually went to a place called Tellico State Park in Tennessee. So that was where we went. There was it was on that expedition. I was not with them, but some other people had a visual sighting. They took pictures of footprints. They didn't have casting material with them, but they took photographs along with the only thing they had for size comparison was some money. So they laid that down and photographed that next to the footprints. And I actually went back out the next morning with them, and we went to the site where it happened, and there was a fair amount of physical evidence as far as the footprint that they found, unfortunately, had been driven over by someone else before they got back the next morning, so they couldn't cast it, but they did have the photographs. Excuse me. And there was some evidence of where we kind of determined it must have been a juvenile because it, according to the people that saw it, we used another gentleman in the group for size comparison who was a little over 6 foot tall, and they thought that it was very close in size to him. And then we could see where it had gone up an embankment. There weren't footprints, but there were definitely marks in the soil where something had climbed up there. Now, the reason that we determined that we did not think it was a bear was that it was a very steep bank, and there was a tree, and there had been a limb sticking out that was probably about 2 or 3 inches in diameter. And you could see where that limb, and they had reported that they saw it reach up and grab a tree limb and help pull itself up, which a bear obviously doesn't do. But that limb was twisted. So whatever had grabbed it had obviously had the ability to wrap its, like, for lack of a better word, hand around it, and as it pulled itself up, it rotated that and actually twisted that limb. And then, of course, you could see the marks in the ground where it had gone up. And that was, to me, one of the more exciting things that happened on that trip. But as far as myself hearing and seeing things, we were out, probably the second or third night of the expedition, and there was a pretty good group of us, probably 8 or 10 people, and we had built a little fire, and we were all sitting around talking, and there were two things that occurred. One was orbs, and I know you had mentioned you wanted to hear about the orbs, and what we saw that night were small orbs, I would say very small by most people's identification. I've heard of pretty big ones, but these ranged, I would say, from the, it was hard to say because they were far away, fairly far, 100 feet at the closest to probably 100 yards at the farthest, but they were probably from marble to golf ball size. And people said, well, you probably just saw fireflies or lightning bugs, whatever term you use for them. And I would say, okay, the problem was they weren't blinking most of the time. They were moving around very quickly, and they were all different colors. They were not the same color. They were not even a similar color. They ranged from red to blue to green and white, just all different colors. And they were in the woods, just like I said, they were moving around. There was no rhyme or reason for what they were doing as far as I could tell. But there were hundreds of them. And it was a very moving thing, a spectacular thing, whatever word you want to use. But I was kind of in awe because I'd never seen anything like that before.
You say hundreds of them?
Yes.
Wow. How long did this go on?
Pretty much all evening. It got to the point where, we had seen them. We had all talked about them. We kind of were in awe of them. But at the same time, they became sort of a part of what was around us. And so we didn't really, after so long, after maybe, I would say, 15 minutes or at most a half an hour of watching these things and talking about them, you just kind of tend to start talking about other things. And, we still kept an eye on them and watched them. And they did kind of come and go. I mean, there were times where they would almost die out to where there weren't any or very few. And at other times they would just, like I said, there'd be hundreds of them all, and they were all in the woods. They weren't, we were in kind of a clearing that was maybe, I'm guessing, it was less than 100 yards across. I don't know exactly how far, but I would say less than 100 yards. And I'm judging that on the size of a football field. It was, I would say, maybe 60 yards across if I was going to guess. And we were kind of near one side of it, and they were pretty much in the woods all around the far side from us, and none of them ever came near us. I've heard people talk about orbs that basically came right up almost to them. This never happened for this evening. They were all, I would guess, again, 50, 60, 70 yards away in the woods. And I'm guessing on the size because it was far away, but they looked almost, from a distance, almost like from a pinpoint of light, which are the ones that I'm guessing were maybe actually the size of a marble, up to something that I would estimate to be the size of a golf ball, maybe a baseball, but I don't think they got quite that big. But all different colors. And again, why they were there, what they are, I have absolutely no idea. It's the only time I've seen orbs in person. I've talked to a lot of people that have seen them. I've seen actually some photographs. People have been able to photograph them. And the other thing that sometimes, as you know, occur with orbs are what are called rods, which look like a rod of light. I always think of like the lightsabers, on Star Wars, only these move and they're like a rod of light, but there were none of those, just these very small orbs all through the woods.
Did they change in elevation compared to the ground, or were they all on a similar plane?
I would say they ranged from 2 or 3 feet above the ground up to probably 20 or 30 feet up into the trees, and they moved both horizontally and vertically. So the same orb, if you tried to watch one orb, which at times was very hard because there were so many, but if you tried to watch one, it would sometimes move up and down. It would move left and right. Not like just across, not in that particular, but it might, they were almost like they were floating. So one might kind of float upward and to the right, and then, across to the left, and, whatever. They were just random patterns, but it was like they were almost like they were floating around.
Would they change speeds?
Yes. Sometimes very slow, sometimes very fast. Now, I'm not saying I didn't really pay attention to whether a particular one first went slow and then went fast or vice versa, but I can say that I noticed some were moving pretty slowly, others were moving very rapidly.
I mean, just those few details alone, my brain's trying to, do the thing that everybody does, like what could it have been?
Right.
And it pretty much rules out everything normal that would produce light.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been down the same thought pattern, the same, this is what continues, everybody says this, and I'm one to be right there. The more research you do, the more confusing it gets.
Yeah.
Instead of getting answers, you just get more questions. And that's definitely where I'm at. I have more questions now than I had 10 or 20 years ago. When I first got into this, and you hear this from people all the time, I was definitely in the flesh and blood camp. I thought they were some kind of an undiscovered primate, whether it was an ape or I didn't really think human back then. It was pretty much, it had to be some kind of an undiscovered ape or a monkey or whatever you want to call it. But as time has gone on, I have become more in the idea that if they're flesh and blood, they're closer to humans than they are to apes. And I'm not even convinced anymore that they are entirely flesh and blood. I don't know what they are, but sometimes, and I'm kind of going back to Bigfoot now instead of just the orbs, but and the orbs are very confusing too. But anyway, the point is that as time goes on, and the orbs as well, I just get more questions rather than more answers.
What do you make of the orb phenomenon? Because you hear a lot of it being reported in the Bigfoot world. Is this something that's connected to the Bigfoot or just happening in the same environments?
Well, It's another one of those that I don't really have an answer to, and I don't think anybody really does, but I have heard reports of people seeing Bigfoot coming out of orbs, or shall we say orbs turning into Bigfoot. I have not witnessed that myself, but you're right. They tend to happen in the same places and often at the same time. And like I said, the interesting thing about the ones that I saw were that size were very small, whereas I've heard other people describe them the size of a basketball or even bigger. I've heard people say they've seen them up to 2 or 3 feet across, and nothing that I saw that night was anywhere near that size. So what they are, what their purpose is, I do not know.
So in your different travels and investigations, have you found yourself in any situation where you felt that you might be in danger or experienced aggressive activity?
No, but let's see, how do I want to say this? I haven't really felt in danger. Well, that time, I guess, in Alaska, I felt like I could potentially be in danger. I didn't know what it was. There was another time when I was on an expedition out in the eastern part of the United States where it wasn't a bluff charge, but something approached us very closely and fairly rapidly in the woods. Now, I don't know what it was. I'm not going to say it was a Bigfoot. I don't know. But it made a lot of noise coming toward us, which typical wildlife doesn't do. In my experience, I've spent a lot of time hunting and out in the woods. And, typically wildlife wants to be quiet, whether it's, and if they make noise going away from you, such as deer if you spook one. But this was coming at us, and it was making noise, and somebody commented that, they felt like it was similar to a bluff charge, but I didn't feel really in danger. I just felt like, I don't know what this is, and I was on guard. Whether that meant I felt like I was in danger, I don't know, but it didn't consciously register that way. But we were all kind of on edge or on guard, and then, it just quit, and there wasn't any more sound, and in a little bit everything calmed down, and we were fine. But that's the only other instance other than the time in Alaska that I can think of that there was something that caused me to feel like there could have been something strange happening, I guess.
Talking about that experience reminded me of several times of my own experiences in the field. That was one of the things that happened on multiple occasions and always kind of bothered me, was you hear them coming in very loudly, whatever it is, and then everything just goes quiet. And eventually the atmosphere changes, everything goes back to at ease, and you realize whatever it was is no longer in the area, but you didn't hear whatever it was leave. There was no noise being made as it left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another one of those questions, more questions than answers. And I would agree that's pretty much what happened that time. And even going back to that incident I talked about to begin with, when I was young, at some point, I would say between 3 a.m. and daylight, whatever that was circling our camp and watching us left. But it did so very quietly. I mean, I'd been hearing it. I could hear footsteps as it circled around. But then when it left, it just left, and that was it. No more sound. So I was going to add one more thing on that trip at Tellico. This was very strange, and you've heard of them mimicking people's voices. I'm sure.
Sure.
But we were all talking, and I had heard this too. It sounded like somebody in our group was saying, like when somebody would say something, there'd be this, and so pretty soon, one of the guys who was sitting there near me, he said, "Is that you doing that?" And I said, "Doing what?" And he said, "Making that, And I said, "No, it's not me." I said, "I assumed it was one of you guys." And so all the guys it was a man, it sounded like a male, and, all the guys said, no, we're not doing that. And I kind of laughed and I said, I guess if it's a Bigfoot, he's agreeing with us. I said, I wonder what would happen if I did something, disagreeable. So I just pretty loudly, I said, no. And it wasn't probably 10 seconds. And this voice came back from very near us. It said, no. And it sounded exactly like my voice.
Oh, wow.
But that was another one of those hair on the back of my neck kind of things stood up. But, we didn't do anything. We all just kind of, looked at each other with our mouths hanging open. But that was one of those mimic moments that you've probably heard about as well.
So you've gone on several BFRO outings, and then you've gone on other outings yourself. Is there an area that you particularly like to go to that is more active than others? Do you have sort of like a home base of research?
Not a home base per se, but I've had very interesting things happen both in western Pennsylvania, particularly the Allegheny National Forest, and then also in Florida in the Panhandle, although, I should say more than one place in Florida. I typically spend winters in Florida, and so I've had very interesting things happen in Florida as well. But I do want to go back to Tellico because I had, as I said, there was some very good activity there, and that's in Tennessee. So I don't have one particular area. I have several, and I'm sure that as time goes on, I'll probably find more.
Is there one particular piece of evidence or experience that you've had that really stands out in your mind as your pinnacle achievement?
Well, I don't know if it's a pinnacle achievement. It's probably a pinnacle failure on my part. I was in Allegheny National Forest, and I pull a pretty big trailer when I go out. I've got a 33-foot toy hauler, and I carry a electric buggy with me because I'm not able to really hike very far anymore. And so anyway, we had a fire going, and we were sitting on one side of my camper, and I don't know how to explain this, but I'll just use directional, like left and right. So if I was facing my camper, which I was actually sitting with my back to it, but let's say I was facing it off to all the people that had gone out that night to do investigations had gone down like a fire trail to my left, and I had a radio at base camp, and they were radioing me from time to time, and there was one other guy there with me. They had all gone to the left. One group had gone down, I would estimate, a quarter mile, another group about a half a mile down this fire trail, and they were sitting. And there was, while this was in a national forest, there was some private property to my right and up a hill a ways. And where we were at, it was gravel, so you could hear things moving around in the gravel. And I heard footsteps coming down from the way of the cabin from my right toward my camper. And I made the comment to the gentleman I was with. I said, it sounds like somebody's walking down. I bet some hunters had came up to that cabin, and they're coming down here to see what we're doing. And he agreed. And so a few minutes goes by, and then all of a sudden we start hearing what people call samurai chatter. I don't really like that term because I don't think it sounds anything like samurai, but nonetheless, it is a chatter, and it sounded amazingly similar to the recordings that were done, known as the Sierra sounds, but it was virtually right. So it came from my right, and by the time we heard the chatter, it was like they were right behind my camper, which was probably from me to where I estimate they were. It was definitely less than 50 feet, probably maybe only 30. And my failure was I sat there and I listened to this for probably a good 20 seconds or more, and there were obviously two different voices. One was lower pitched, the other was a little bit higher. They were both deep, but one was way, much deeper than the other. So I'm assuming it was maybe a male-female couple. I don't know. But anyway, they were doing their chatter, and then by the time I thought to turn my recorder on, I literally, the instant I hit the button to turn it on and record, they stopped. And I don't know if they somehow heard something, although there was no click. I don't know if they sense EMF. It's hard to say. But anyway, they immediately stopped, and we heard them walk away through the gravel again. You could hear the crunch, crunch, crunch as they left. And that's probably the thing that stands out in my mind as kind of the most impressive thing that has happened to me. Now, the next morning when it got daylight, we did go out and look for footprints, but, in gravel, you could see some impressions and some scrape marks, but definitely no castable or recognizable, not even pictures, something you could take pictures of for footprints. But that was a very exciting thing that happened. And, somebody said, that was a once in a lifetime happening. And I think that's probably true.
Did you have lights on in the camper and everything?
No, everything was dark. The only thing we had was a fairly small fire going where we were sitting.
Wow. Yeah, that would be pretty interesting. And again, if we're talking about the possibility of it being hunters or humans or whatever, the idea of someone creeping up on somebody's camper after dark like that, you tend to announce yourself, and let people know. I just, again, it doesn't really make sense.
That's what I would have expected. That's what I was expecting prior to the chatter starting. I was expecting somebody to say, hey, how you guys doing? Or, something. But instead, we got the very distinctive sound that has been recorded, I think, in more than one instance. But definitely and, I made the comment to the guy I was with later. I said, what amazed me, and he agreed with this completely, but I said, what amazed me was that it sounded almost exactly like the Sierra sounds that were recorded 2,500 miles away.
Yeah.
And that was very surprising to me because I would assume that, especially if these are flesh and blood and they're scattered all over the United States, that they would at least have different dialects, similar to what the Native Americans would have had years ago. They had different languages, and some of their languages overlapped. But, your East Coast Native Americans, I don't think, talked at all like the natives out on the West Coast. And so that was one of the things that really surprised me, was the similarity in the way it sounded.
Yeah, that was something that stood out to me as well, is how you can go to all these different locations. And I know that people have different opinions whenever it comes to stick structures. And I know that we don't have any proof that says Bigfoot makes these stick structures. But what I can tell you is, regardless of where you go, you find them in areas that are purported to have Bigfoot, or that have all the right things for Bigfoot to be there, but the structures remain the same no matter where you're at. They're all the same designs. And I always wondered, so are these things being taught, and were they all one group at one time to have that knowledge and moved it to different parts of the country? And like the language thing, how does the ones on the West Coast speak the same language as the ones on the East Coast if they all weren't the same at some point?
Yeah, and I have it's not my own theory. I've heard other people say it as well, but as time goes on, I have become more of the opinion that the structures are also some form of language that we haven't figured out how to read yet. But as they build these structures, or they put, what some people call glyphs, they make certain patterns with sticks and so forth. I think they are communicating with each other somehow. Some people say, well, they might be warnings of territory, or, whatever. I don't know what they are, but I do know that they're are very similar. I just saw a friend of mine had posted where he had taken a picture of a stick pattern that he had found in the forest, and a friend of his and mine also had found a stick structure and posted a picture. These two pictures were taken about 10 miles apart, but they looked identical. So the odds of that happening randomly, some people say, well, the sticks just happened to fall that way. All right, well, how do you get two patterns? And these were fairly complex patterns. How do you get two patterns 10 miles apart that look exactly the same? Barring that some person is going around doing that, but then I say, okay, what would be their purpose in doing that? And doing it out in the middle of the woods where they don't know if anybody's necessarily going to find it or not.
Right.
And certainly, what are the odds of, if they're doing it, if some person is doing it, okay, they have to think that somebody else is going to find these two structures 10 miles apart and think, oh, that's just like the one I saw the other day. So it's another one of those questions, what are they? But I think they're definitely a communication system of some sort. I don't know what kind.
I've experienced something similar where we were investigating a location where these things were reportedly visiting a dumpster behind a restaurant here in Oklahoma. And on the backside of this dumpster were some peculiar markings made by something with a hand and fingers. Again, can't say that it wasn't human, but it was odd. But one of the markings in particular that was repeated a couple different times, it looked like something took 3 or 4 fingers, and if you can just imagine someone drawing the number 7 with all the digits at the same time.
Yeah.
This was posted online, and a researcher who at the time was with the BFRO, Stan Courtney, up in Illinois, I believe, contacted me and had a photograph of the same exact pattern that was left on the window of his vehicle whenever he had parked in an area and gone out and investigated and come back. It was on the driver's side window.
Oh, wow.
And he sent me a photo of that, So, again, same marking showing up. Could have been a person in both scenarios, I guess. But again, very odd. And the similarity, it looked like the exact same thing.
Yeah.
I've started to wonder if the stick structures and things like that aren't of a spiritual nature instead of communication.
Well, that could be. But again, I think if it is, then, they're still communicating in a way. They're saying, okay, here's our spiritual symbol,
right,
for lack of a better way of saying it. And then other Bigfoot come along and see it, and they say, oh, it's kind of like us. If we see a cross, we relate it with Christianity. If we see the Star of David, we relate it to Judaism. And so maybe there are different spiritual beliefs, and they're using these symbols to depict that. Just like humans do. Again, I try to, it may be wrong of me, but I oftentimes relate things they do or compare things they do to things humans do, and try to look at the purpose or try to figure out an answer based on that. Now, I might be completely wrong in doing that. It might not have anything to do with that, but at least that's the best way I've come up with to try to maybe get some answers to things.
This is something that we didn't really talk about previously, but you had mentioned it, and we went down some other avenues, but I wanted to bring it up. In the worlds of Bigfoot and the paranormal and UFOs, aliens and all that, I don't know if it's a new thing, but it seems to be growing in popularity. That some people theorize that all these things are kind of one and the same, and they're all demonic in nature.
Right.
I know that you have a little bit of history in the area of religion. What are your thoughts on the possibility of Bigfoot being a demon?
Well, I think it's possible. As time goes on, again, at one time, I thought it was probable. I've kind of moved away from that. I don't really know. It's definitely, to me, a possibility. And I don't want to, as you said, go too far down the rabbit hole, but they could all be that, and there's no way for us to really know. I guess the reason that I think it may not be the case is what we talked about earlier, that, theoretically, if they were demonic, they would all be bad. They would all be trying to do harm to people, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, with that said, I don't think that all people that are possessed by demons are necessarily obvious in their demonic nature. They sometimes are just people that collect information, so to speak, and pass it on. And again, I'm trying to be kind of broad here, and I don't want to get too far down the hole. But like I said, I think it's possible. I don't know that I think it's probable. But on the other hand, I really have no idea what they are at this point. I guess one of the things I would say that I think makes it a possibility is their ability, according to eyewitness reports, to do things that seem supernatural, as in appearing or disappearing, or mind speak in a sense is supernatural. And these are things that could be attributed to something that is spiritual, i.e. demonic in nature. So that's, I guess, my primary thoughts on that.
Have you encountered, outside of Bigfoot, I mean, what you believe was a demon?
I will say that I believe that there are people that are possessed who don't demonstrate that in the sense of what people think in, like, your, what was the movie? The Exorcist. So head spinning around, foam coming out of the mouth. Yeah, I've never seen anything like that. But I will say that I believe that I have been around people who were possessed, but their purpose of possession was simply to collect information And this is typically collecting that information from within a church to keep an eye on what's going on. And I believe that because as a Christian, I believe that Satan focuses his primary. First of all, Satan isn't everywhere. Satan is not omnipresent like God is. So Satan has to have a way to keep track of what's going on so he knows where to focus his primary efforts. And he does that through demons that possess humans. We know that from the Bible. The Bible talks about demon possession and has instances of Jesus casting demons out. But he uses those demon-possessed people oftentimes to collect information and relay that information back to him. And that's the closest I can say I've ever came to demonic activity. I've never been involved in a exorcism, although I can tell you there are people outside of the Catholic Church that do exorcisms. And I have talked to some of those people, and their advice to me has always been to stay away from it unless you want to become fully immersed as they are. You don't want to get involved, because once you become involved, then they will start attacking you. And of course, we saw examples of that in The Exorcist, where the Catholic priest that was trying to do the exorcism would be attacked personally, physical harm done, thrown across the room, whatever. So they said, don't get involved unless you want to become fully involved. And so I never really got very involved.
See, that's part of the thing that bothers me is there are similarities between some of the stuff that goes on in the Bigfoot world and how demons are depicted. Mm-hmm. And we joked at the beginning about the Bigfoot curse, but it's something that you become fully aware of whenever you get involved in this. And then you also hear stories about people oftentimes starting to experience activity at their home after they start investigating and going out in the field, these things following them. And it has ruined lives. It absolutely has ruined some lives. So there's just some interesting similarities here and there. So I was just curious about your opinion on it.
Yeah, no, there are similarities, and I'm aware of, as well, of people who have had them follow them home, and they have said, well, the only way that they could do that, the only way they would know, because in some of these instances, the people lived 20, 30, 40 miles from their research area, and yet they were followed home. And they said the only way that could happen was if they were somehow spiritual in nature, because they would have to be able to know where you were, without actually physically being there.
Right.
So I have heard the same things, and I think that, I have no reason to think the people saying that were anything but truthful.
You mentioned orbs. Have you experienced any other phenomenon outside of Bigfoot and the orbs, ghosts, or UFOs, or anything like that?
Not personally. I've taken some reports from people of rakes, and for anybody out there that's not familiar with a rake, the best way I can tell people to find out what they are is to type in RAKE in a search engine. Only you have to do more than that, because otherwise it's going to take you to Home Depot. But put in rake and then the word cryptid, like CRYPTID, or rake entity, something like that, and it will bring up pictures that people have taken of rakes, as well as drawings and depictions. But I've had several reports. I've seen pictures. I saw a picture a year or so ago of a rake that was captured in Pennsylvania on a trail cam, and so rake would be the other thing. Now, as far as things that I've heard, and this is back to Bigfoot related, I will say that I was on an expedition in the Florida Panhandle, the Apalachicola National Forest, and there was a lady in the group, and she could do amazing howls. She had been trained in voice, and she could just do amazing howls. And so one night, I was not with her, I was with some other people, but we heard what we pretty well knew was her do a howl. But the odd thing was, over the next 5 to 10 minutes, we heard 3 more howls come from different directions. And at one point, I think after the second one, it had came from the direction towards our base camp. And I said, oh, somebody at base camp just did a reply to her, and they sounded just like her. And then we heard 2 more, and they were from yet other directions. And so, a while later, we all got back to base camp, and we were talking, and then her group came in, and we said, wow, those were some good howls we heard. And she said, I only did 1. She said those other 3 were replies, and they were not from anybody in our group, and they sounded just like her. They were back to the mimicking. I mean, they sounded exactly like her howl, but from different directions. And the odds, I think, again, this was at probably midnight, 1 a.m. time frame. The odds of other humans being out in the Apalachicola National Forest that were able to replicate her howl, the odds of that are almost zero. And so that was definitely a very interesting evening. And that was on the last night of, this was not a BFRO expedition, but it was a private group that had gotten together. And then the other instance was in the Green Swamp in Florida, which is down in central Florida between Orlando and Tampa. And I had been out, we had done some night investigation, and I got back and I was inside my camper. And, you asked a question earlier, and I had forgotten this one, about whether I ever felt like in danger at all. This night probably fell into that category, because we had gotten back, I was inside my camper, and something came up outside my camper. Now, I guess it could have been a wild animal of some kind, but if it was something I had never heard anything like this before. But it was making the most, go back to our demonic thing, ungodly sounds. I mean, it was a cross between growls and screams, and it literally sounded like it was right outside my camper. And I have to say that as much as I want to, in some ways, see one of these up close, that particular night, I was afraid to go outside. I didn't want to open my camper door. I didn't have a light. My flashlight had broken earlier that same day, and I didn't feel comfortable opening my camper door and going out into the dark to see what it was.
Well, before we get off here, do you want to talk a little bit about CSI?
Yeah, that'd be great. I appreciate the opportunity to do that. I have organized a new organization. It's Cryptid Search Investigations. And my goal in this is for it to eventually be nationwide, just like the BFRO. And the reason that I wanted to do this is I want to do several things, I guess. And before I go on with that, I guess I should finish. The organization is a nonprofit. It is currently authorized as a 501c3. So any money that people might donate will be tax deductible. I have some expeditions planned. None are set in stone yet, but hopefully one in the Allegheny National Forest area in October, early October, and then late October, one in South Carolina in, I always have trouble saying the name of this place. It's Oconee, I think, State Park. It's Oconee. And so we're going to be there late October. And if people are interested in those, they can, my email for the organization is cryptidsearch@myyahoo.com. And they can email me for information about that. But currently I'm not having a set amount of money the way that BFRO does. I'm asking for donations from people. I feel like if people that don't have the money to go on a BFRO expedition want to be involved, this is a way for them to get involved. And that's part of why I wanted it to be a 501c3, so that donations are tax deductible. So for those people that can afford to make a donation of, a sizable donation, it will be tax deductible for them. Trying to think what else I should add to this. I don't have my website up and going yet, but it should be within the next week or two, and it will be at cryptidsearch.org. I have a Facebook page that's called Cryptid Search. Now, there is a space in between cryptid and search on the Facebook page. And I'm hoping at some point to get a podcast of my own going. And I have a YouTube channel currently and Rumble called Cryptid Search. So people can just start looking for Cryptid Search. Oh, the other reason I wanted it to be a nonprofit is so that when I'm gone, it will continue. So currently, the organizations, I shouldn't say all of them. I did find out there is at least one other nonprofit Bigfoot organization. But let's just, if I can, I'll just use BFRO as an example. That is formed as an LLC. And, when the current person in charge passes away, maybe a long time, we hope, but when that happens, there's, as far as I know, there's no succession there. With CSI, it will have a succession in that it's a nonprofit. We have a board of directors, and they will simply get, I'm the president right now, they'll get another president. Things will just continue on, and that was part of my goal in the organization, was to have something that would continue. People can definitely email me if they want more information, or they can follow the Facebook group as well.
And I will just say, an organization like this is, first off, a great idea, especially the nonprofit aspect of it. But for people looking to get their feet wet or to get involved in this, these type of outings are the way to go. This is a great opportunity to meet Bigfooters that maybe have some experience, and meet other people that are kind of new to it and everything, and go out there with like-minded people and learn things and experience this for yourself.
Right. We are going to develop, as time goes on, specific scientific experiments and use them to help further the understanding. And by that, I mean, I can't say what any of these are yet, but I have some PhD scientists that are going to work with me to help develop experiments that we can do to further our understanding. And now the average person that comes on an expedition does not have to be involved in that if they don't want to be, but if they choose to be, they can. And that's another thing that, I feel like there are some other organizations, I think, out there. The Olympic Project comes to mind, but that are doing some actual scientific experimentation. But I think the organizations doing that are pretty few and far between. Most organizations are just doing expeditions, and they provide experiential evidence, meaning people's experiences. Like you and I have been talking, my experiences are experiential, but I want to get to the point where we actually have some scientific information going on that will allow more understanding of what's going on out there in the Bigfoot world, the orbs, the dogmen, the, on and on and on, rakes and pugwudgies, and you name it. We want more information on all of this stuff.
Mark, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sharing your experiences and your stories. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, my friend, and I wish you the best of luck with CSI.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. And hopefully you and I can stay in contact and talk about some of these things further.
Absolutely. If you've had your own encounter with Bigfoot or something else you can't explain, send me an email at bigfootcrossroads@gmail.com. Check out the website, bigfootcrossroads.com. You can find links to social media, past episodes, merchandise, everything you need, all in one place. And until next time, remember, there's something in the woods.